If you've lived past 70, have you ever felt like your life is a house filled to the brim, packed with memories, with things you once cherished, with objects that once held meaning, but as time passes, some of those things start to feel less like treasures and more like burdens, cluttering not just your home but your heart. George, at 75, had lived a full and meaningful life, a loving wife, children who had grown into good people, a career that once gave him purpose. He had stories of laughter around the dinner table, the smell of his wife's favorite perfume lingering in the air, and the echoes of friendships that had stood the test of time. But as he stood in his quiet house one morning, staring at a closet packed with clothes he no longer wore, a thought settled into his mind like dust on an old bookshelf. Do I really need all of this? At my age, what truly matters? That single question stayed with him as he moved through his home. He ran his fingers along the spines of books he hadn't opened in years. He traced the outline of an old suit, one he had once worn to important meetings back when he was someone. Now it just hung there, untouched, a relic of a past life. In the hallway, a pair of running shoes sat near the door, shoes that had once carried him on morning jogs, but now simply gathered dust. The truth was, George didn't run anymore. He didn't need the stiff business suits, and as he looked around, he realized that so many things in his home were no longer a reflection of who he was, but rather of who he used to be. It wasn't just about material things. It was about the weight of expectations, of routines that no longer served him, of obligations he had outgrown but never questioned. He had spent years holding on to traditions, habits, and even relationships out of familiarity rather than necessity. And maybe it was time to let go, not just of the old clothes or the cluttered shelves, but of the things that no longer brought joy, no longer had a place in this chapter of his life. But how do you begin? How do you know what to keep and what to release? Maybe this is your story too. Maybe you've also felt the heaviness of things, both physical and emotional, that no longer fit the person you've become. The truth is, sometimes the key to peace isn't adding more to your life. It's making space for what truly matters. So today, let's take that first step together. Let's explore what it means to lighten the load, to embrace this stage of life with clarity and intention. If you've ever felt this way, share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this journey resonates with you, don't forget to like and subscribe, because together we'll uncover the wisdom that makes our later years truly golden. George stood before his old wooden wardrobe, the morning light casting long shadows across the floor. The house was quiet, save for the gentle creak of the closet door as he pulled it open. Inside, neatly arranged but untouched for months, hung the garments of a life well lived. Each shirt, each jacket, each pair of trousers held a story, a memory, a piece of the past. Yet as he stood there, he felt something shift within him. These clothes no longer felt like a reflection of the man he was. Instead, they were remnants of who he used to be. He reached for a light blue button-down shirt tucked in the back, its fabric rough between his fingers. The collar was slightly frayed, the color faded from years of washing. He had bought it on sale, not because he loved it, but because it had been a good deal. Even on the day he first wore it, he had felt the stiffness of the fabric against his skin, the way it clung uncomfortably in the summer heat. Yet he had kept it, convincing himself that one day it might soften, that one day it might feel right. But it never did. That shirt was a small thing, but it held a greater truth. How many times had he held on to things simply because they were familiar? How often had he tolerated discomfort, told himself that he could get used to something that would never truly fit? Life had a way of accumulating such things, habits that no longer served him, relationships that drained rather than uplifted, obligations he had accepted out of duty rather than joy. He looked at the shirt one last time before folding it and setting it aside. Some things were never meant to be kept forever. His eyes moved to the heavy brown leather jacket that hung near the front, the one he had worn in his younger years. He smiled as he ran his hand over the worn sleeves, remembering how it had once made him feel. Strong, confident, ready to take on the world. It had been his signature piece, the jacket he wore on nights out, on long drives with the windows down, on the kind of adventures that felt infinite. Back then, putting it on had made him feel invincible. Now it felt different. The shoulders were too stiff, the sleeves a little too snug. It had hung in his closet for years, untouched, not because he intended to wear it again, but because it was a piece of his past, a symbol of the man he once was. But that man no longer existed. The years had softened him in ways the jacket never could. He was no longer the man who stayed out late, who danced without a care, who believed that time stretched endlessly before him. And that was not something to mourn. Aging did not mean losing himself. It meant growing into a new version of who he was, one shaped by experience, by wisdom, by a deeper understanding of what truly mattered. The jacket had served its purpose. It had carried him through a beautiful chapter of his life. But it did not belong in this one. With a quiet nod to the past, he folded it carefully and placed it in the pile. At the bottom of the wardrobe, he found a stack of worn-out clothes, old t-shirts, faded sweatpants, things he had worn long past their prime. These were the clothes of comfort, the ones he reached for when he no longer cared how he looked. They were stretched, stained, torn in places, but he had kept them because they were easy, because they required no effort. He had told himself it didn't matter anymore, but standing there now, he realized that it did. He had spent his whole life taking care of others, dressing sharply for work, looking his best when it was expected of him. And somewhere along the way, after retirement, after the passing of his wife, he had stopped doing it for himself. He had let himself fade, as though appearance no longer mattered, as though self-respect was something only the young needed. But taking care of oneself was not about vanity. It was about dignity. It was about looking in the mirror and seeing someone who still mattered. He took a deep breath as he picked up each piece of clothing one by one and placed them in a bag. Letting go of these things was not just about clearing space in his closet. It was about clearing space in his life. He no longer wanted to hold on to things that made him feel lesser, that reminded him of the past without serving his present. He wanted clothes that felt good on his skin, that made him feel comfortable and confident. He wanted to wake up each morning and dress with intention, not out of habit. As he closed the wardrobe, he felt a sense of lightness settle over him. This was not just about getting rid of old clothes. It was about making a choice, about embracing who he was now instead of clinging to who he used to be. It was about understanding that life was not about accumulating, but about knowing when to let go. He sat down in his chair, looking at the pile of clothes he had set aside. He had thought it would be difficult, but it wasn't. It felt right. It felt necessary, because at 75 he was still living, and he deserved to live in a way that honored the man he had become. George sat by the window, watching the world move at its unhurried pace. The afternoon sun bathed the neighborhood in a golden light, casting long shadows on the pavement. The days seemed quieter now, softer in their passing. And yet every year when his birthday approached, there was an underlying tension, a quiet expectation. He knew that his children would call, that friends might send a card, and that someone inevitably would suggest a celebration. Birthdays had once been exciting, a time for gathering, for laughter, for cake and music. But now they felt different. They were no longer markers of joy, but reminders of time slipping away. Somewhere along the years, the meaning had changed. And George had begun to wonder, was it necessary to celebrate at all? Last year he had given in to the idea of a party. His children had insisted, "You're turning 74, Dad. Let's make it special." And so he had allowed them to plan an evening gathering at a restaurant, a small but elegant affair. Friends had come, some traveling from out of town. There had been warm embraces, conversations filled with nostalgia, the clinking of glasses raised in his honor. On the surface, it had been a perfect evening. But when George had returned home that night, he felt exhausted, not just physically, though his body ached from hours of standing, from smiling, from engaging in conversations that felt just a little too long. There was a deeper exhaustion, one that settled into his bones, into his thoughts. He had spent the entire evening making sure everyone else was comfortable, making sure the atmosphere was light and enjoyable. Yet in the quiet of his empty home, he realized something unsettling. Had he truly enjoyed his own birthday? The days that followed confirmed his suspicions. He was drained, needing more rest than usual. The energy he had spent on the party took a toll, lingering like an unwelcome guest. That was when it struck him. Perhaps he no longer needed these grand celebrations. Perhaps at this stage in life, what he needed most was rest, simplicity, and the permission to decline traditions that no longer brought him joy. That realization led him to think about other birthdays he had witnessed, especially the ones that seemed more about obligation than celebration. He remembered his old friend Thomas, who had once thrown himself a lavish birthday party despite struggling financially. Thomas had always been a man of pride, someone who refused to let others see his hardships. That year he had rented a venue, ordered expensive food, and ensured that every guest left with a parting gift. The night had been extravagant, filled, with speeches and laughter. But later, George learned that Thomas had quietly taken out a loan to cover the costs, a debt that would take him months to repay. Why had he done it? Because there was an unspoken expectation that birthdays should be marked with something grand, that aging should be met with fanfare. But George had come to understand something different. A meaningful birthday did not require a price tag. It did not need a hall full of people or a table overflowing with food. It needed only sincerity, whether that meant a quiet dinner with a loved one or a moment of reflection on the life lived so far. And then there were the birthdays that carried a different weight altogether, the ones that arrived not with joy, but with sorrow. George thought of his own experience after his wife had passed. The first birthday without her had been unbearable. Friends had encouraged him to go out, to let them throw him a small gathering, to keep himself surrounded by love. But the truth was, no amount of company could fill the space she had left behind. That night, as everyone raised their glasses, he had felt an ache so deep it was almost physical. The music, the laughter, it had all felt wrong. Because the one person who had always made his birthday special was no longer there. After that, he had stopped celebrating in the way he once did. Not out of bitterness, not because he didn't appreciate the well wishes, but because he had found a different way to mark the day. Instead of parties, he took long walks in the park they used to visit together. Instead of cake, he made himself a cup of tea and listened to the songs they used to dance to. And somehow, in those quiet moments, he felt closer to her than he ever had at any crowded gathering. Birthdays, he realized, did not need to be loud to be meaningful. They did not need to be expensive to be worthwhile, and they did not need to be forced if they no longer brought happiness. This year, as his 75th birthday approached, he made a decision. There would be no party, no reservations, no speeches, no pressure to entertain. Instead, he would spend the day exactly as he wanted. Perhaps he would wake up early and watch the sunrise. Perhaps he would sit on his porch with a good book, letting the hours pass in peace. Perhaps he would visit his wife's favorite spot by the lake, just to feel close to her. And perhaps, just perhaps, this would be the best birthday yet, because it would be his. There was a time when George felt like he had nowhere to be. The house had grown quieter over the years, the days stretched longer, and a part of him wondered if he should be filling that space, going out more, keeping busy, proving to himself and to the world that he was still engaged with life. But experience had taught him something different. It wasn't just about going places, it was about choosing the right ones. Some places, no matter how familiar or enticing, carried a weight that was better left behind. Others held distractions that offered nothing meaningful. And some, though full of wonder, required a level of caution he could no longer afford to ignore. The first place he had learned to step away from was the cemetery. In the first year after his wife passed, George visited her grave religiously. Every Sunday without fail. He would bring fresh flowers, clear away fallen leaves, and sit there, sometimes speaking softly as if she could still hear him. It became a ritual, something to hold on to when everything else felt unsteady. But over time something shifted. He began to realize that each visit left him feeling heavier, not lighter. The act of going, of sitting in that space, did not bring comfort as he had hoped. Instead, it anchored him in grief. One day, as he placed a bouquet of white lilies at her headstone, He looked around and noticed the others who had come to visit their loved ones. Some stood in silent mourning, others knelt in quiet prayer, but there was a solemn stillness among them all, a weight that no one seemed to be able to shed. That was when it struck him. His wife was not there, not in the ground, not in the cold stone that bore her name. She was in the warm summer air, in the scent of the roses she used to plant, in the music they had once danced to in the living room. She was in the life they had built together, not in the space where it had ended. That day George made a quiet decision. He would honor her not by visiting her grave, but by tending to the things she loved. He began spending time in the garden she had cared for so meticulously, pruning the roses just as she had taught him. He played her favorite songs in the evening, and let himself remember her in laughter, rather than in loss. The cemetery would always be there, but he no longer needed it to feel close to her. Then there were places he had visited that left him feeling not sorrowful, but hollow. Once, on a whim, George had agreed to accompany an old friend to a casino. It had been years since he had stepped into such a place, and at first there was an odd sort of excitement in the air, the bright lights, the hum of conversation, the clinking of coins spilling into trays. But as he sat at a table watching the people around him, mostly men and women his age, eyes fixed on the flickering machines, he felt something unsettling settle in his chest. These were people looking for something, distraction, excitement, a thrill that might make them forget, even for a moment, the aches in their joints, the loneliness that sometimes crept in at night. But the more he watched, the clearer it became that whatever they were searching for, they weren't finding it here. An elderly man a few seats away muttered under his breath as he lost another round, frustration knitting his brow. A woman in a sequined blouse clutched her cup of coins as if they were the last bit of hope she had. George suddenly felt out of place. Was this really how he wanted to spend his time? Chasing something fleeting, something empty. He left early that evening, walking out into the cool night air with a clarity he hadn't expected. He wanted joy, but not this kind, the kind that vanishes the moment the lights dim and the winnings are spent. He wanted something deeper, something lasting. And he knew exactly where to find it. His true happiness had never come from places like that. It had come from evenings spent sharing stories with old friends over a quiet dinner. It had come from the satisfaction of fixing something around the house, of feeling useful. It had come from watching his grandchildren's faces light up when he told them one of his favorite old tales. That was the kind of joy worth chasing, the kind that left him fuller, not emptier. But there was one more lesson life had taught him, one more kind of place he had learned to be careful with. George had always loved the idea of adventure. Even in his 70s, he still had an itch to explore, to see new places, to experience things he hadn't before. And so one year, he had decided to take a solo trip to a small town he had never been to. It had been beautiful at first. The streets were lined with old bookstores, the kind he could lose himself in for hours. He had wandered through markets, tasted new foods, enjoyed the feeling of being somewhere unfamiliar. But then, as the sun set, he realized something troubling. He had taken a wrong turn somewhere, and the streets, once charming and inviting, suddenly felt foreign and confusing. His phone battery was running low. He tried retracing his steps, but nothing looked familiar. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of fear. Thankfully, a kind stranger helped him find his way back to his hotel. But the experience lingered with him. He wasn't as quick on his feet as he used to be. He couldn't rely on his instincts, the way he once did. It was a humbling realization, but not a bitter one. He could still explore, still travel, still experience the world, but he needed to do it differently now, more cautiously, more intentionally. Now, when he traveled, he chose places where he had friends or family nearby. He planned his routes ahead of time, made sure he had everything he needed. He had learned that independence was a wonderful thing, but so was knowing his own limits. There was no shame in being careful, no shame in choosing safety over spontaneity. As George sat on his porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he felt a quiet sense of peace. He had spent years chasing things, closure, excitement, adventure, but in the end, what truly mattered was knowing where to find what nourished his soul and letting go of the places that no longer served him. The cemetery had been a place of sorrow, but he had found ways to honor his wife in life, not in mourning. The casino had been a place of distraction, but he had learned that true joy was found in real, meaningful moments, and the unfamiliar streets had reminded him that exploration was still possible, but only with wisdom and care. Life, he realized, was not about filling every space, about going everywhere just for the sake of movement. It was about choosing the places, the moments, and the people that truly made life worth living. George sat on his porch, the gentle rustling of the trees whispering through the evening air. The day was coming to an end, but instead of the heavy exhaustion that used to weigh him down, he felt light, unburdened in a way he hadn't in years. He looked out over his small but well-kept garden, the roses blooming in delicate shades of pink and white. His wife had loved those roses. For years, his life had been filled with things, some necessary, some sentimental, some simply accumulated, over time without much thought. His closet had been stuffed with clothes he no longer wore. His days had been cluttered with obligations and routines that no longer served him. His heart had carried grief, expectations, and attachments to a past that could not be changed. But now his closet was lighter. His calendar no longer dictated his happiness. His heart, though still bearing the marks of love and loss, no longer felt weighed down by sorrow. Letting go had not come easily. There had been moments of hesitation, moments when he questioned whether he was discarding too much, whether he would miss the things he was leaving behind. But each time he released something, an old shirt that no longer fit, a tradition that no longer brought joy, a place that no longer served him, he found himself breathing a little easier. It wasn't about rejecting the past. The past had shaped him, had given him stories worth telling, memories worth holding on to, but life was not meant to be lived backward. And in his 75 years, if there was one thing he had learned, it was this: true peace does not come from what we hold onto. It comes from knowing what to release. He had let go of uncomfortable clothes, and in doing so, he had embraced the freedom of wearing only what made him feel good. He had let go of birthday celebrations that felt more like obligations than joys, and in their place, he had found simple, meaningful ways to honor his life. He had let go of places that no longer nourished his soul, choosing instead to fill his time with experiences that brought him real happiness. He took a slow sip of his tea, the warmth spreading through him. This was what life was meant to feel like. Not rushed, not heavy with unnecessary burdens, but light and full of quiet moments that held their own kind of beauty. At his age, he no longer needed to impress anyone. He no longer needed to chase after things that weren't meant for him. The world told him that growing older meant losing something, losing youth, losing ability, losing relevance. But sitting here, feeling the evening breeze against his skin, he knew that was a lie. He had not lost anything. He had gained something precious: clarity. A deep, unwavering understanding of what truly mattered, and what mattered was not how much he had, but how much of it truly brought him joy. He thought about how many people, young and old, still carried more than they needed: possessions, expectations, regrets, the weight of what-ifs. He thought about how much energy was spent holding on to things that no longer served them, and he wished for them the same lightness he had found. If there was one lesson he could share, it would be this: you do not need to carry everything. You are allowed to set things down. You are allowed to choose what stays and what goes. It was never too late to make space for peace. The sky darkened and the first stars appeared. George leaned back in his chair, feeling completely at ease. He had spent so many years trying to hold on to things, afraid of what would happen if he let go. But now he saw the truth. Letting go was not the end of something. It was the beginning, and perhaps the best years of his life were not the ones behind him, but the ones he had yet to live. If you have ever felt weighed down by things that no longer bring you joy, if you have ever wondered whether it's time to release something and make room for peace, I encourage you to take that first step. You do not need to do it all at once. Start small. A single choice, a single change, a single decision to embrace what truly matters. And if this story has resonated with you, I invite you to share your thoughts. What have you let go of in your own life? What did it feel like to release something that no longer served you? And if you'd like to continue exploring reflections on life, wisdom, and the journey of aging with grace, consider subscribing. Sometimes, the greatest lessons come not from what we add to our lives, but from what we choose to let go.